Hello, and welcome to our Saturday Matinee. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And today we're going to be talking about some of the local connections and Canadian connections to the Second World War, and looking at that broad context of Canadian involvement with the war itself. The Second World War is a massive topic with many components and parts that can all be individual presentations on their own. So this really is an overview, a survey, if you will, of those Canadian connections to the Second World War, and some references to our local servicemen who served and fell during that conflict. This presentation is an introduction to a lot of the research that we have been doing into the fallen soldiers and support personnel from historic Mississauga who served and fell in the Second World War. When we look at the Canadian overview of the Second World War, a lot of it comes down to statistics and numbers in terms of our understanding of Canadian involvement and that commitment. Canada had a population just over 11 million people in 1939, and 1.1 million Canadians served in uniform during the war. 730,000 in the Army, 260,000 in the RCAF, and also other flying corps overseas, 115,000 in the Navy, Medical Corps, over 34,000 people. The numbers are daunting and relentless sometimes, but they also don't capture necessarily that human story, those individual lives, if you will. 42,042 are known killed during the Second World War, and 54,414 wounded. And so just an astronomical look at just over 96,000 casualties of the 1.1 million who served in the First World War. It's estimated that just under 3,000 people from Peel County served. That's now the region of Peel. And within that, 86 known fallen from historic Mississauga. And so it really does, when you look at the numbers themselves, it is an incredible story of service, of contributions from here at home to this broader conflict overseas. What these numbers don't include, however, is the wartime industries and home front efforts to support the war overseas. And so you also had an incredible number of people that were engaged in munitions and wartime industry manufacturing, as well as the aid organizations and the volunteer groups that supported the war overseas. So it was an all-encompassing war in terms of the society, the economy, industry, and of course the armed services themselves. When we look at kind of the known statistics locally to Mississauga, we have 86 known fallen from historic Mississauga. Of those 86, 79 names are listed are engraved or remembered on Mississauga-based cenotaph, war memorials, and honor rolls and the like. The average age of our 86 fallen was 24 years old, and we are developing and will be sharing biographies of our 86 fallen soldiers from historic Mississauga in the months to come. Much like the First World War, propaganda is very much part of the story, and the posters, kind of that raw, stand up for the empire, or defend the Commonwealth, if you will. Canada moving forward on its own feet of encouraging young men and people to support the war effort and to enlist. These are just a couple of those posters that were quite prevalent at the time. The Second World War as a whole, again, this is going to be an overview presentation and a much larger perspective of Canadian involvement. It really is a complex timeline. A lot of parts to it that are often, they're not seemingly related to each other. Canada's combat efforts were focused largely on Western Europe, Italy, and the Atlantic. But there were other theaters of war, including Southeast Asia and Burma and India, Egypt, and of course the Pacific, all of which had Canadian involvement and some local connections. Sometimes it's difficult to comprehend Canada's involvement within the context of the entire war, but our soldiers our personnel, our medical corps. They were there, they served, and they fought and fell in these many theaters of war overseas. So to give kind of that timeline perspective of Canadian involvement, of course, we know the connection of the Second World War to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Allied opposition to Nazi Germany. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st of 1939, and the United Kingdom declared war on Germany as a result of its alliances on September 3rd of 1939. So as of September 3rd, 1939, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and England, they're at war with Germany. However, unlike the First World War, in which when Great Britain declared war on Germany in the First World War and Canada was automatically at war, as of 1931, the Statute of Westminster gave Canada autonomy over its own foreign policy. So it was up to Canada to decide its own course of action following the British declaration of war. After a special session of Parliament that debated the war was declared. Canada declared war on Germany on September 10th of 1939. So when Canada declared war, and this is one of the oddities, yes, we declared war on Germany September 10th of 1939. Canada declared war on Italy on June 11th of 1940 and on Japan on December 7th of 1941. So there's actually several declarations of war. But it's the first one that draws Canada into the beginning salvos of the Second World War, and that's in September of 1939. A special session of Parliament was called on September 7th by Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, and a proclamation of war was against Germany was signed on September 10th, 1939, and given royal approval by King George VI. And so Canada was at war as of, again, September 10th of 1939. Canada's initial commitment was said to be limited. They were focused on providing a minimum commitment of armed soldiers, and that was to be one division overseas and one reserve division. Of course, very rapidly, those numbers were exceeded, very similar to the buildup from the First World War. But Canada saw a commitment and a need that it could fill in terms of providing war materials to support the war effort, raw products, its industrial ability to support Great Britain. It almost seemed like a moral imperative that they do so, but also food. Britain was under great shortages at that time as well, and so Canada really stepped up to the fore to kind of commit that help. But of course, the armed commitment increased as the war went on. The Battle of Atlantic was the longest ongoing engagement, if you will, during the war itself. Canada sought to supply Great Britain and kind of were opposed by the German Navy and principally the U-boats that would attack convoys. And so very much part of Canada's story was the Battle of the Atlantic. According to Mackenzie King, it was a self-evident national duty to back Britain. Supply chain of resources, it was vital, and in the course of the war, 25,343 successful escort voyages from Canada to Great Britain. In that time, 59 Canadian merchant ships and 24 warships were lost. One of the interesting things was at the beginning of the war, Canada had a very minimal Navy component here at home. And at the end of the war, we had the third largest Navy in the world. The buildup of the Navy was an incredible part of Canada's war story during the Second World War. As part of the Battle of the Atlantic, it also that conflict was drawn into the Battle of the St. Lawrence, so as it was known, which was anti-submarine actions in the St. Lawrence River and the Gulf of the St. Lawrence between 1942 and 44. There were occasions of German U-boats striking into Canadian territorial waters and attacking supply ships. 23 merchant ships and 4 Navy ships were lost to German attacks, like U-boat attacks during this time period. And it really was a direct threat in Canadian coastal waters. And so we don't often think of those terms of kind of the war coming to our own shores. Not the only time that happened as well. Canada in the Battle of Britain will probably recognize words like the Blitz, the German Luftwaffe attacking British cities. But during this time, Canada was a key supplier for Britain with foods, weapons, war materials through their naval supply convoys. Many Canadians also served as pilots, air crews, and observers during the Battle of Britain between 1940 and 1941. But indeed, that involvement of Canadians as air crew and pilots and gunners and the like did not diminish. That was a major part of Canadian contributions to the Allied war effort. The Battle of Hong Kong took place between December 8th and December 25th of 1941. 2,000 troops, Canadian troops, were sent to Hong Kong, largely from Winnipeg and Quebec, to assist in its defense against Japanese invasion. They faced overwhelming odds, and despite a resilient attempt at repulsing the Japanese invasion, they were unsuccessful. 290 Canadians were killed, and another 264 would die over the next 4 years in atrocious conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps. There's one of the lesser known aspects of Canadian involvement in the Second World War. Dieppe Raid, back on the European front. Canada's politicians have been urging for some time for Canadian armed involvement because after the fall of France, the Allied powers had found themselves pushed out of mainland Europe, and it's firmly in German control. There was an attempt made at Dieppe on August 19th of 1942. 5,000 Canadian troops from the 2nd Canadian Division landed on the beaches of Dieppe, but it was largely a futile and ineffective raid. They attempted to infiltrate a heavily fortified coast. 60% of those that landed at Dieppe were killed. Of the 5,000 Canadians, 3,367 did not return home. Dieppe became a lesson for the Allies in what not to do. All the material that was lost and left behind, and the lives that were lost as a part of it. It was a futile attempt to gain a foothold on European soil. But again, the part of the Allies learning of how to conduct or what to expect in terms of landing personnel and material, and kind of that process that would be needed to be followed 2 years later when they returned on force to try to mount an attack on European soil. The Italian campaign, which was the largest scale engagement by Canadian divisions during the Second World War, lasted from July of 1943 to March of 1945. And this was a Canadian-led invasion of Italy against the fascist regime in Italy. Major areas of conflict include the Moro River Campaign, Monte Cassino, the Battle of Ortona, and battles to break what were known as the Hitler Line and the Gothic Line areas of German defense within Italy, amongst many others. There were 25,000 Canadian casualties estimated during the Italian campaign, which lasted the rest of the majority of the war, and saw Canadians landing first in Sicily and then in southern Italy and pushing steadily northwards through Italy. And very much, again, the largest component of combat engagement by Canadian troops during the Second World War was in the Italian peninsula. D-Day in Juno Beach, following the failure of Dieppe, and the efforts returned to making an Allied landing and invasion on European soil. And the day was selected, eventually came down to being June 6th of 1944, what was known as D-Day as part of Operation Overlord. And the Americans and British and other allies were assigned different objectives, and the Canadian objective was known as Juno Beach. The 14,000 Canadians were involved on D-Day with 359 killed. The Canadians, particularly the Queen's Own Rifles, found themselves the farthest inland of all of the attacking troops that day, where the beachheads were secured, and the Allies finally had a foothold on mainland Europe in June of 1944. Really the beginning of the turn of the tide against Nazi Germany. This began a relentless push inland into France, into Belgium, into Netherlands, eventually on the outskirts of Germany, forcing eventually the surrender of Germany. The Battle of the Scheldt took place between October 2nd and November 8th of 44, Belgium and the Netherlands after the liberation of France. And the goal was to drive the German defenders back and open a route to the port of Antwerp. 135,000 Canadians were involved over the prolonged Battle of the Scheldt, with 6,367 killed in the various towns. They literally went town to town through the countryside, pushing the German resistance before them, but it was not without casualty, and it was certainly a fierce fighting. The German army had been a long way from collapse at that point, and still presented formidable opposition. Liberation is part of the story, not only the liberation of towns and villages and indeed countries from German occupation, but also Canadians came face to face with the Holocaust during the liberation of the Netherlands, and specifically the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Canadians were also involved in the liberation of Nazi camps elsewhere in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, and the atrocities seen there and reported there became defining moments for many Canadian troops. And within this context of Canadian involvement and focusing as we do on the fallen soldiers from home, it's important that we do not lose sight of some of those bigger topics of conversation, including significantly that of the Holocaust. The Battle of the Pacific was also something that Canadians found themselves involved in, and a little known event occurred on June 20th of 1942 when a Japanese submarine fired upon the Estevan Point Lighthouse in British Columbia. It was the first enemy attack on Canadian soil since 1866 in the Fenian Raid. So again, a little known fact of the war, that when it came to Canadian soil and a lighthouse being fired upon in British Columbia. Canada committed 2 Army divisions along with air and naval resources to the Pacific Theater of War. Canadians were also stationed with air crews in India and Burma, including individuals from historic Mississauga found their path to Burma and beyond as part of that story. On the home front, Canada became a major supplier of food and war materials in support of the Allied war effort. Again, as mentioned earlier, Canada's population was just over 11 million people, with over 1 million who worked in wartime industries. So you had 1 million in wartime industries, you had 1.1 million serving in the various armed forces, plus on top of that, you had the volunteer groups that were involved in supporting the war effort. So a complete commitment in terms of the country. Additionally, 2 million people worked in agriculture and communications, and very much part of the story of Canada's war effort. Women also became incredibly prominent in the workforce during the Second World War, in large part due to the able-bodied men having enlisted in large numbers overseas. Aid organizations also helped to organize the population to support the war effort at home. These included things like the Red Cross, Women's Institute organization, Women's Aid organizations, Women's Institutes, church organizations, a whole range of different women-led organizations that organized to support that war effort at home. Industries here in Mississauga, like Dominion Small Arms Limited, which was created in 1940, starting production in 1941. By 1943, 5,500 employees worked there to 3 shifts, producing 30,000 units a month. Those are Lee Enfield #4 rifles, Mark II Sten submachine guns, and the ammunition associated therein, and a myriad of other military components. And women from all over Canada were employed in the company. We were also home to Victory Aircraft, which was a government-created entity out of National Steel Car. And Victory Aircraft was created in November of 1942 to principally oversee the development of the Lancaster bomber airframe or airplane as a key contributor to the Allied war effort. In Malton, here in Mississauga, 422 Lancaster bombers, 8 modified Lancaster XPP mail planes, and 1 modified York transport were built between 1943 and 1945. Again, 422 Lancasters, and that's the picture there of Lancaster #100 being rolling out of the assembly line. So that contribution to the war effort is an incredible part of not only Canada's story, but also right here at home, Mississauga's story to the Allied war effort. Also connected to the bomber development, but other airplanes as well, was what was known as Ferry Command. Ferry Command was originally organized by the Royal Air Force in Britain, and it operated in Canada between 1941 and 1943. And its principal motive was to oversee the delivery of North American-built aircraft to the war theaters overseas. Over 9,000 aircraft were piloted overseas by Ferry Command and delivered to the Air Transport Auxiliary, who then would take the planes to their final destinations for service. Interestingly, as the Air Transport Auxiliary, there were several Canadian female pilots who flew as part of that. So while they didn't fly over the Atlantic, we had several women from Canada who served with the ATA, flying aircraft once they arrived in Britain to their service destinations. We also were home to the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which was a massive multinational joint aircrew training program throughout the British Commonwealth. Malton was home to what was known as the #1 Elementary Flying Training School. There's an aerial picture of the British Commonwealth Air Training Facility in Malton. The plan, as it was known, trained over half of all pilots, navigators, air gunners, wireless operators, and flight engineers who served during the war, not only with the Royal Canadian Air Force, but also with the Royal Air Force and the Royal Naval Air Service overseas. So it wasn't just Canadian pilots and airmen didn't just fly for Canada at the time. Many flew in British units as well. Bomber Command was something that was organized by the RAF, and a #6 group of the RAF's Bomber Command was an RCAF unit, a Canadian unit. A third of all Bomber Command Bomber Command aircrew were Canadians. The Bomber Command suffered the highest casualty rates of all branches of service. Over 10,000 Canadian casualties from Bomber Command during the war, but that included over 25,000 sorties that were flown. It was vital in the success of the Allied war efforts, although civilian losses were also enormous. As you might imagine, kind of indiscriminate targeting of enemy targets involved massive payloads of bombs being dropped in a wide area. So while intrinsic to the war effort and certainly part of our Canadian story and involvement, that had an enormous civilian impact as well. Looking at the kind of the close of the wars themselves from a timeline perspective, VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, is celebrated here May 8th of 1945. The German surrender agreement was signed in France on May 7th of 1945, although the news was withheld for 24 hours, so it was announced on May 8th. Germany's unconditional surrender, again, marked on May 8th of 1945. Celebrations were held throughout Canada, although, again, the war was not over because war continued with Japan. VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, is celebrated in Canada in August 15th of 1945, although different countries have some different dates that they mark the ending of the war. Of course, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, which brought a swift conclusion to the war against Japan. But again, enormous civilian impact. Canada had a smaller role in the Pacific and largely attached to British and American units, although they were committed to send more before the end of the war, including a commitment to redeploy Lancaster bombers as part of the Tiger Group. But the war ended before that took place. Japan announced its unconditional surrender on August 14th, 1945, and news reached Canada that the war was over on August 15th of 1945. The Japanese Instrument of Surrender was signed on September 2nd of 1945, and that's a date that many countries recognize as the end of the war. Although technically, peace was not achieved, or peace did not resume until the San Francisco Peace Treaty was signed on September 8th of 1951, formally ending a state of war. So a little bit of a trick question there. When did the war end? In Canada, again, we marked August 15th of 1945 as VJ Day. Remembrance, there are many components we've only touched on. Again, deserve a great deal more examination in future programs. And of course, the Holocaust and the horrors brought on by the Nazi and fascist movements overseas. And also, we can't overlook anti-Semitism here at home. It certainly did not end with the war. We have, darker chapters of our history involved Japanese-Canadian internment during the Second World War. Mississauga and elsewhere in Canada were home to German prisoner of war camps. And of course, we see at the end of the war, division of Europe into the Soviet and American or democratic spheres of influence, the partition of Germany into East and West, and the building of the Berlin Wall, and really that beginning of the Cold War between the United States of America and its allies and the communist regime that had risen and entrenched itself in Russia, or in what was then the USSR. And that very much comes part of shaping of the 20th century is the aftermath of the Second World War. When we look at kind of connecting it to home and Canadian and Mississauga involvement, faces begin to tell a story again. 86 no fallen, or 89 no fallen, and 79 names on cenotaphs, the average age of 24. And again, faces start to tell part of that story. These are all our people, and not everyone was a man. We do have a couple of women who passed in service in the Second World War as well. But the faces begin to tell a little bit of that story, and who are they, where do they live, and that's part of what we're developing with the biographies of fallen soldiers. Names to faces, we have 1941 and 42 and 43, we have fallen each year, but the enormous year of casualty, of course, is 1944, which is the height of kind of active combat involvement. Lesser amount in 1945, but every one of these is a life left behind, a life lost, a family left behind at home to mourn and to move on. Remembrance becomes part of our story. Names are added to our existing war memorials and cenotaphs in Port Credit and Streetsville. In the years that followed the Second World War, new cenotaphs were created. So Mississauga, again, not home to one single cenotaph, but home to many that predate the city of Mississauga itself and connect to many of those early areas of population, Streetsville and Port Credit and Lakeview and Arundel, Orm Park and the like. Many of these communities had their own memorials to those soldiers who served and those who did not return home. And they were added to memorials that were created following the First World War and become very much etched on our landscape. So with that, thank you for joining us for a Saturday matinee for a very quick survey look at Canadian involvement in some of our local connections therein. And this is something we'll look to expand in the months ahead as we share more information around our research project around remembering our fallen soldiers from historic Mississauga. Thank you.